Welcome to Renegade Inc. All this geopolitical hot air was always going to be about gas, and predicting that meant that before all the horse trading and brinksmanship began, we caught up with two independent energy experts, Irina, Slav and Aris. They cut through the noise and explained contextually the fundamental problems Europe and the UK now face to quite literally keep the lights on. Irina, Slav, welcome to Renegade Inc. Great to have you on the programme.
Thank you for having me.
Irina, our audience hear all the time that we have an energy crisis, Europe's energy crisis. And then they see their bills coming in the UK every month, and prices have gone through the roof. There's no debating that. Can you put those two things together by first describing what Europe's energy crisis is, and the second thing, what that means to the average punter on the street?
It all started last autumn when people started preparing for the winter, when demand for energy hits a peak because of all the heating demand. And it turned out that Europe doesn't have enough natural gas in storage. But that was just part of the problem, a big part of the problem, but not the whole problem. The other part of the problem was that wind power generation wasn't as abundant as in previous years. This is something that was admitted openly by the biggest turbine makers in the world, or said investors. Simply put, these were the two parts of the problem. Too little gas in storage and not enough wind to power the turbines that a lot of European countries, the UK and Germany especially, have.
So prices going up is simply because of scarcity?
I'd say so, yes. For the most part, there's also speculation as we went into winter and prices started rising because of the insufficient supply of gas. Speculators naturally did what speculators always do. They buy and expect the price to go up, and then they sell.
There's a little oil pipeline that is coming into Europe, into Germany in fact, from Russia, and it's called Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 has been quite a contentious project, hasn't it? Can you just explain what Nord Stream 2 is, what it's carrying, who it's supplying, and why there's so much contention around it?
Well, I think one thing that a lot of commentators and decision makers seem to forget is that it's Nord Stream 2. There is already one Nord Stream pipeline, which has a capacity of 55 billion cubic meters annually. And it is already supplying about, I think, a third of Russian gas to Europe. So what Gazprom is doing is doubling the capacity of this pipeline in view of securing energy supplies, mostly for Germany. Germany will be the biggest beneficiary because it's closing its nuclear reactors and it will be closing its coal plants soon. It's a consortium. Let's not forget that Gazprom is not working alone. It has partnered with some really big European companies for Nord Stream 2. And they're all looking to capture this additional demand.
Why do we hear so little about Nord Stream 1?
Because it's been in operation for years. You can't stop it. It's been there for years. It's not so interesting. The interesting part is Nord Stream 2, because it's new and because the United States has only recently become a force to be reckoned with in natural gas exports.
So this is LNG gas, isn't it? Liquefied natural gas.
Yes.
The Americans are producing it now quite well. What they want to do, correct me if I'm wrong, they want to put this gas on ships, tankers, bring it across to the European market and sell it to the Europeans. Is that correct?
Right. That's exactly what they've been doing now, amid the crunch.
So this really is a business call, isn't it? Insofar as the Americans don't want the Europeans to have cheap gas from Russia, they want to be able to flog their gas to the Europeans. Is it that simple?
To me, it is, yes. Most things in life are simple, to be honest. And it's when it comes to commodities, it's about money, really. It's about markets. And the shale boom that we saw in the US in the past decade or so unlocked a lot of natural gas. and natural gas demand in the United States has been relatively flat, and forecasts are that it will remain relatively flat in the coming years. So all this gas that's coming out of the ground in shale formations has to be sold somewhere. And Europe is a very good market. It's a market that makes sense because it uses a lot of natural gas, and it will use even more.
Surely, if I'm a gas producer and I'm shipping gas across the Atlantic to Europe, that gas is going to be a lot more expensive than if it's coming through a pipeline from Russia. Again, am I being too simplistic?
Well, no, you're stating facts. You're being logical, I'd say.
So why, if I'm a European government, am I going to buy more expensive gas that's come across, environmentally is a problem, but it's come across the Atlantic, come to Europe? Why am I going to buy that if it's more expensive, and I'm not going to buy that and it's come from Russia?
Because you don't want to be dependent on one single supplier of gas.
Ah, okay.
This is the argument in favor of not just American LNG, but Australian, Qatari, what have you. Diversification has been a big theme for the European Union, or rather it used to be a big theme before they went on a renewable rush. And now it's coming back on the agenda, this diversification of gas supplies, because there isn't enough gas and people want electricity.
The mind boggles when you mention Australian LNG. Imagine, so I'm just talking about bringing it across the Atlantic. Now we're bringing it from Australia. What's the cost of that going to be? It'll be £1 trillion a tonne by the time it gets to Europe.
Well, it probably won't be cheap. But just today, now that you mentioned Australia, just today I read an article in the Financial Times about Santos Energy, the Australian gas producer, saying that it will hardly be able to fill any gap left in European gas supplies if Russia turns the tap off.
But the reason they cite is because all that gas is already earmarked for the contracts in Asia.
Exactly, yeah.
How much of the recent rhetoric and media war, information war that's gone on in Ukraine, how much of that is to, let's say, drum up support for America putting more sanctions on Russia when it comes to energy? Can we make a link between those two things?
Well, we can, unfortunately, yes. I mean, probably not everyone would agree, but I think it has a lot to do with gas. The US has been against Nord Stream 2 from the very beginning. They have been looking for ways to sanction it, to stop it. Obviously, this pipeline is a big problem for the United States.
How does all this pan out? How does it play out? Because from where I'm stood, Biden hasn't got a hope in hell of really stopping this, nor have the Americans. I know that they want to sell their LNG over to Europe. That's a curious move, but there we have it. How does it play out? What goes on from here?
That's a really tough question to answer because it could play out in a number of ways. But just as an example, the United States has become now, this year, the biggest LNG exporter in the world because of the European energy crisis and because prices are high enough for American producers to start shipping gas to Europe. And now I'm hearing that European utilities are beginning to reconsider their unwillingness to sign long-term supply contracts with US producers. So the producers might score some long-term contracts, which might undermine Nord Stream 2, but not really, it won't be a make or break situation because there are not enough LNG import terminals in Europe. American LNG cannot fully replace Russian gas.
Having had this conversation with you, I didn't realise it was this simple. If I sat down with a class of 8-year-olds and explained and put a map on a board and explained all this, these 8-year-olds would get it. It's quite hubristic, isn't it, from the Americans to say, actually, what we can do is impinge on this energy market in Europe. we can get this gas away because it's good business for us, and we can then also, in some way, bloody the nose of Russia because they won't be taking the. It is a sort of. I mean, when you put the business case down, it's bizarre. When you put the geopolitical case down, it's odd. And really, you could explain to a toddler that this isn't going to work.
Well, I don't know what to say, but yes, things tend to be simple on a very basic level, and then it's all complications and a lot of noise, as you pointed out. There is way too much noise around all this. It's all about the reliability of renewable energy, or rather the lack of. And the very simple fact that people need energy and they will want to get it regardless where it comes from. Once you start freezing at home, you wouldn't care about emissions.
I thought this was a lot more complicated than it actually is. I'm quite alleviated. The big problem, of course, now is we've got woeful political leaders across Europe who can't see the wood for the trees on this and will reliably make the wrong decision at every term, and sadly the consumer gets landed with that bill.
Yeah, it's very likely that they will continue to make the wrong decisions. And just recall, we talked about American LNG, and I mentioned long-term contracts, but Europe has a problem with American LNG because of the way it is sourced. The European Union believes that fracking, hydraulic fracturing, is a very dirty, polluting way of producing natural gas, which will add to the bill for American LNG for Europe. They really are in a very confusing situation, and they put themselves there.
If you were to advise a Prime Minister, say the UK Prime Minister, you would advise him or her on what to do next, what would you say from an expert standpoint? What would you say from an energy security policy standpoint? What would you advise?
Well, I would probably recommend that they slow down on the wind and solar, wind mostly in the UK. Just take a bit of time to think whether this new renewable energy capacity can indeed replace fossil fuels. And then I would advise that they think about backup, regardless of where it comes from. Maybe try to be a little more pragmatic than ideological.
Beautifully simple, very pragmatic, using lots of logic. You must never go into politics.
I have no desire to do that.
Irina, Slav, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Ben Aris, welcome to Renegade Inc. Really great to have you on the programme.
Pleasure to be here.
Ben, it strikes me that when we talk about Europe's energy crisis, actually, a lot of the waffle that we hear from pundits and commentators can be cut through quite quickly. Can you give us your view on what's happening when people talk about Europe's energy crisis?
Yeah, there's plenty of energy. The politics is interfering with it, but the gas crisis in particular that we're going through, that sent prices spiking. And here in Berlin, our personal power bill has gone up, something like doubled as a result of all of this. But there's two things going on. There's the economics of it, the market stuff, and then there's the politics. And actually, most of the increases recently has been caused by what we described in a piece recently as a V-shaped market. That in the winter, Christmas 2019, that there was an extremely mild winter. And then that meant, and at the same time that Russia and Ukraine were negotiating a new gas transit deal, a key deal, which everyone thought was going to not happen. And so the gas producers, both on the EU side and the Russian side, filled their tanks to capacity in order, if there was going to be an interruption in the transit. As it happened, that deal was done at the last minute. And so the Russian gas is flowing through Ukraine and will do until 2024. But then the winter, Christmas 2020, was extremely cold. And so you went from having a gas glut where nobody bothered to refill the tanks and sold the gas off over the course of the year to coming into the summer of 2021, where the tanks were suddenly depleted because of the extra demand of this cold winter. And so the market was that, there's not enough gas in the tanks. Everyone realized around August, and suddenly the prices spiked from like $200 per thousand cubic to over 1,000 and reached a peak of 2,000, with 10 times the normal. But at the same time, in addition to this, there's Russia has this new pipeline, Nord Stream 2, which they're trying to hook up. Because Europe actually, what they did is they stopped signing long-term contracts and switched to a spot market. And that's why the prices could go shooting up, because you weren't buying long-term where you signed off on $250 per 1,000 cubic. Suddenly you had to go to a spot market. There wasn't enough gas, right. And so the prices went through the roof. And then Russia, in order to persuade Europe to sign up on these long-term contracts, because it has this new pipeline, it has new fields in the Arctic, it needs to sell that gas. And those Arctic fields are dedicated to Europe. You can't send that gas anywhere else. The pipes don't exist to send it to China. And so what Russia's done is they're like, right, you've got some long-term contracts. We're going to scrupulously stick to the terms of those contracts, but you're asking for more gas. We're not obliged to sell you anything else. And so they're just like sort of work to rule. And that's put pressure on Europe, but Europe is refusing to sign these contracts. And the last thing I'll say on that is that Russia sends about 200 billion cubic meters to Europe every year. And this year, there was a shortfall of about 15. It's not very much. And the new pipeline, Nord Stream 2, has a capacity of 50. So if it got turned on, this gas crisis would finish tomorrow. And it could literally be turned on tomorrow. It's full of gas. But in Europe, they don't want to do that because Gazprom says we're going to turn it on if you sign these long-term contracts. So there's a kind of a standoff. And it's the consumers that pay for this politics. You know, Europe needs the gas, but it's unwilling to sign these deals.
Of course, it's the consumers that pay. They always do. It's interesting that we don't talk about Nord Stream 1, the pipeline, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's been online. It got exemptions because, look, at the bottom line is that Germany and Europe, 30% of their gas comes from Russia. And when these deals were first signed in the 70s, it was like 80, 90% of the gas came from Russia. So there's been significant diversification. But that 30% is still significant in so much as, you know, if you stopped buying Russian gas, you can't get it elsewhere. The LNG business has started, but there's just simply not enough ships in order to replace that. And most of that gas is headed to Asia, which is totally dependent on LNG because, you know, Japan has no energy at all other than LNG. So Europe is in the Nord Stream 1 went to Germany. It needs that gas. It goes under the Baltic Sea. It doesn't go through the war zone in Ukraine. It doesn't have to go through Poland where it becomes more expensive because of transit fees. And the idea was to add the other line, the Nord Stream 2, same deal, cheap, easy, reliable, safe, secure gas. But that also meant that Russia can cut Ukraine off. And so again, you get a whole bunch of politics involved because Ukraine badly needs the $2 billion a year it makes from the transit business.
With Nord Stream 2, how much of the noise that we're hearing over Ukraine is indirectly related to the Americans not wanting that pipeline to flow? Because if we look at President Joe Biden and what he says in one of his more lucid moments, he said if Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again, and there'll be no longer a Nord Stream 2. And then when asked for more detail on that, of course, he couldn't give it, but he said, that's it, it's not going to happen. How much of the shouting in Ukraine is about Nord Stream 2?
A lot. And Nord Stream 2 is actually one of the most divisive issues, particularly between the States and Europe. The view on it is very different. I mean, one of the other factors you have to include in this extremely complicated story is the fact that the US used to be a net importer of gas, but then they discovered shale and there's been the shale revolution. And now it's a net exporter of gas because they have significant shale deposits. And it's making a lot of money because now the States is the biggest importer of LNG to Europe. And LNG, because it's liquid, natural liquefied gas, it's compressed and has to go on these super tankers, is actually more expensive than pipe gas. Pipe gas is the cheapest you can get. Right. And so you've got someone like Germany who's looking at, well, let's have this pipeline, which is a secure source of limitless amounts of gas. The amount of gas that Russia have in Yamal in the Arctic is enormous.
And environmentally cheaper because there isn't a surcharge on it.
No, and the US gas is fracked gas. So there's a huge environmental cost there as well. So the Germans are like, actually, we'd rather have pipeline gas because it's cheaper and it's safer and it's cleaner. And, with the new Green Deal they're trying to do, this is actually, we need some gas because we can't power the whole country just on solar and wind, because where would you get the power from at night? So you need some gas. The opinion on sanctions in Europe is much softer because Europe has significant economic interests in Russia and the States has almost none. So the States are being much harder than Europe is, and Europe is trying to find some sort of compromise, middle path between the two. There's two camps on what's going on in Ukraine. The first camp is that Putin thinks that Ukraine's not a real country. He said as much to Bush when Bush visited Moscow. He wrote this big essay, more or less saying the same thing. And that camp thinks this is all about invasion and either annexing Ukraine or at least returning it to Russia's sphere of influence. The other camp, which I belong to, is this is all about NATO, that Putin's been complaining about NATO expansion. And his fear is that eventually, and it's clearly not going to happen soon, but eventually Ukraine will join NATO and there'll be intermediate range missiles on the Ukrainian-Russian border where it can hit 80% of the population and most of the large cities with missile flight times under 5 minutes, which you can't defend against. So he's putting his heels in now. And he wants a security deal now. And he said that repeatedly. And I don't believe it's anything else than what it says on the can, what he keeps saying. Because I should make this point too, that Putin offered a security deal in 2008. It was the first thing he did when that term started, actually it was Medvedev, and it was rejected out of hand. And the Russians had a very detailed plan, and Putin's been talking about this since 2003, the NATO expansion. So what they've done this time is they've built up such a credible threat of violence that they've forced the issue onto the negotiating table. Biden made it quite clear he wanted the Russian problem to go away, and now it's his major headache. So Putin's already scored a victory.
Vladimir Putin's fear, though just being pragmatic about this, is well-founded, isn't it? That NATO expansion has gone on and on and on. They've kept going east. And really for him, it's a legacy issue, isn't it? That he wants to absolutely nail this now for the future of Mother Russia. Safe.
While he can. I mean, people are saying NATO membership for Ukraine's not on the agenda. There are no NATO missiles in Ukraine. What's he worried about? NATO is a defensive organization.
Yeah, but...
And he's going, Cuba. Look at Cuba. When the Soviet Union put missiles into Cuba, JFK freaked out and there was nearly a war. And they're saying, and Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, has actually explicitly said, this is another Cuba, that you're proposing eventually to allow Ukraine to join, and then NATO missiles will come in. And then they point to the missiles that have already gone into Romania and Poland, pointing at Russia. And the ones in Poland include offensive missiles, not just defensive missiles, Tomahawks. And they're putting at all of that and saying, look, the same thing's going to happen in Ukraine. It's entirely predictable. And so we're going to nip this in the bud while we're strong enough economically and military, and long before Ukraine actually formally starts the accession process.
How does it all pan out? Starting with Nord Stream 2, looking then at the European energy crisis, and then finally geopolitically. Give us a very quick, if you can, rundown of those three areas, and then ultimately what it means for all us people across the UK, Europe, who don't want war and do want cheaper energy prices.
Well, the cheaper energy prices, I mean, that's a huge motivation for the Germans, because if they turn Nord Stream 2 on, then energy prices for the consumer would drop immediately. And it actually, ironically, although the States have been saying it undermines European energy security, it actually improves it. Because if you think what the proposal is to pump more Russian gas through the extremely old and leaky Ukrainian system, which is due to be decommissioned anyway. And instead switch it to a brand new pipeline. But Ukraine's at war with Russia, so sending your gas through a war zone, how does that improve your security? It doesn't. In terms of the argument over the security deal, that's very difficult. But what's going on now is we started with this demand, guarantee us legally no Ukraine in NATO ever. And in the meantime, since Macron got involved about 2 weeks ago, the emphasis has switched to implementing the Minsk II peace accords that would bring fighting in the Donbass to an end. And that's significant, as part of that would be to create an autonomous region within Ukraine of Donbass, which is effectively now under Russian control. And that would give Russia a de facto veto on NATO membership for Ukraine. And the Kremlin would accept that. And the thing with Minsk II is everybody wants it.
Yes.
It was a deal done by Merkel. She wants it. Macron wants it. Everybody wants it. They don't want it in Kiev because it's political suicide, because you effectively lose control of Donbass, although it stays in the country. But stepping back for a moment, the irony is if Minsk II went through, everybody wants it, it would end the war in the east. Ukraine would be at peace. Russia would have its guarantee of no NATO. It would be happy and it would stop interfering. And then Ukraine would boom, if you ask me.
Yes.
If it had peace and stability, it would boom. The Ukrainians would come out really well, but they would have suffered this humiliation of losing control of one of their regions. In effect, not on paper. De jure, it would still be Ukrainian and under Ukrainian control. And that's a compromise I think everybody can live with. And we heard Scholz and Macron when they were in Kiev, they're pushing exactly this on the Ukrainians. And Zelensky, the president, remains reluctant, but he's in a terrible situation. The Ukrainian economy is being battered by this, and he needs to end it at some point.
Really crystal clear analysis. Ben, Aris, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.